Dorothea Dix was a progressive reformer who focused heavily on asylum and other mental health reforms, and through that helped create dozens of new institutions in both the United States and Europe, abolished many cruel and often negligent practices, and changed people's views of these groups worldwide, ridding many of the idea that the mentally ill could not be helped or cured. As well, she helped reform the medical system, creating many more opportunities for women as a Civil War nurse. Despite, or perhaps because of, her troubled childhood and adult life, she was a strong force for change and spread her message incredibly far. She was born in Hampton, Maine, in 1802. Her parents were alcoholics. Her father was a preacher, often traveling far away, while her mother suffered from serious depression. From very young, she practically ran the household and cared for her two younger siblings, developing a love of books and learning, as her father taught her what he could. At 12, she moved in with her grandmother in Boston, who provided the girl with the best education she could muster. As an adult, Dorothea established a series of schools in Boston and Worcester, designing them entirely to her own ideals and teaching in them as well. Her health began to deteriorate, however, forcing her to back off from her career, but rather than settle into nothing, she wrote. Her books were simple but insightful and sold well. However, she eventually was forced to close her schools entirely. She traveled to Europe while ill and met groups of reformers focused on treatment of the mentally ill, and returned with a new focus. She began to move her teaching efforts towards groups of prison inmates, and, upon realizing the abysmal conditions that they lived in, started campaigning for improvement in the hopes that she could better their situations. Around the 1840s, prisons and asylums, often merged together, were awful. Some of the many issues involved, usually caused by the overall lack of regulation, included an extreme lack of hygiene, the housing of violent criminals in the same spaces as the mentally ill, and an extreme amount of corruption among officials and jailers, leaving inmates of any kind subject to the whims and terrorizing of those they were held by. She traveled to as many public and private facilities as she possibly could, documented each and every problem she found with her brutal honesty, and proceeded to present it all to the Massachusetts legislature, pushing heavily for official reform. Prisoners at the time, whatever the reason for imprisonment, were often treated atrociously, records in her writings encompassing many instances of prisoners being flogged, starved, chained, physically and sexually abused by their keepers, and left naked and without heat or sanitation. Yet previously few had worked to change this. After her efforts in Massachusetts, she traveled the country, pushing many other states to improve their conditions. Even as politicians pushed back against her works, she continued to campaign, and opened her own asylums in New Jersey, North Carolina, and Illinois, redesigning several others in accordance with her own strict principles. Despite her attempts at federal legislation for a national asylum, however, that did not pass. From there, she continued to tour, this time overseas, to report on various international hospitals. When the Civil War began, she paused her insistent asylum reform to serve as a nurse for the Union Army, eventually designated as the Superintendent of Army Nurses. The standards she set for newly recruited nurses were extremely high, but it was very advantageous, the veritable army of nurses extremely crucial to building their role in the war and the medical field. At some points in the war, she treated both Confederate and Union soldiers, earning respect from many. Even as female nurses were actively disparaged and pushed away, Dix worked for formal training and other opportunities, and over the war she appointed roughly 15% of the Union Army's nurses. She stepped down in 1865. As the war came to a close, her persistence and effectiveness were officially recognized, and she founded 32 hospitals over her time working as a nurse. After the war, she worked to raise funds for a memorial to Civil War soldiers, and returned to her crusade for the mentally ill and disabled, until she died on July 17, 1887, in a New Jersey hospital founded in her honor. Over her lifetime, she had a huge effect on the conditions that those who could not care for themselves were kept in, thanks to her relentless work and ideas. Many of her actions were as effective as they were due to the fact that she worked within the conventions of her time, submitting these asylum reports to the government in the only way that a woman was allowed to at the time, only involving herself in the movements that she deemed necessary for her own agenda. Even as she grew involved in the war, and her professions leading her to see the worst of human beings, her compassion and enthusiasm held steady. Dorothea Dix belongs in the AP U.S. History Hall of Fame for her incredible contributions to 19th century medicine and constant push to fix what was wrong.